Welcome to the last formal session of this meeting, the panel discussion. I wanted to first make a little organizational announcement. So those of you who were interested in this lab visit, we have assembled that list and we should be able to accommodate you all. And what we want to do is, after this is over, we'll give you about 15 minutes to collect your baggage and so on. So it would be better to take along your coat and so on because it's complicated to walk back. And then we will guide you to the lab. As you know, the paths are somewhat obscure sometimes, so we have people who take you as a whole group. That's just for that. So maybe I'll just explain a bit what we planned with this panel discussion. I'll talk about the science in a moment, but just in terms of organization, we have some questions that we might start off with the panel, but at any point, we're interested in having questions, comments, participation of the audience, and we have asked Vincent to mediate that a little bit for us, who will watch over your response. And we have our two helpers, Jonas and Sebastian, there, who will give you a microphone, and then we'll organize it as usual. And of course, it's the best if we're on one topic that we then get questions on that topic, and so we'll try to do this in a timely. It will not always be perfect. When we go off to another topic, then maybe you could jump in with related questions. So it's going to be somewhat spontaneous and somewhat structured as well. Yeah. Okay. So I thought so to start with an impression that I had. I thought it was really. Curious that we saw in a lot of the talks sort of very simplified worlds. In the experiment, there's one or two objects on the table, and curiously, in the robotic case, also we have these very simplified worlds. And I have a suspicion that it's for different reasons. In the experiment, I understood everything depends on everything, and so you have to simplify. Just for scientific reasons, but you're not assuming that infants or children cannot deal with more complex situations, or can you? I don't know. And in the technical sense, we're simplifying, obviously, because we haven't solved everything. But I also wonder if there might be aspects that where new qualities come in as we scale. For instance, in what you just told us, Yiannis, imagine that if a lot of actions go on at the same time, we have that attentional problems for the actions as well, and what action we want to focus on, and maybe we have some continuity about that. So first I was going to invite the panel maybe to discuss that a little bit. I know it's a topic that when people from the outside look at that, they hear embodied language, and then it's still really very, very simple. So a question we have to address at some point. Anyone wants to jump in?
All right, I'll jump in a little bit. So I would say the motivation for simplified worlds in my world is twofold. There is certainly a component that's the basic scientific component of trying to isolate the factor that matters, and so simplifying things down as much as possible so that I can do the manipulation I want with some confidence with the children, that's what's going on, and then be able to see the result of that manipulation. It is also the case, though, that in the child system, I'm simplifying somewhat to try to not overwhelm them, keep them on task. Sorry about that. Try to keep them on task because they are able to kind of flit around and do other things rather easily. So that's an issue. I do think that it also, though, scaling up to make more complex situations does bring in a lot of very interesting new questions, right? So one of the questions that was talked about in the last talk, that issue of attention, right? And so I talked about the cognitive system and the child's attention kind of structuring what's happening in the event and the information they have. As soon as I scale it up to have multiple objects out there, then how does that attention get directed would really be a critical issue in terms of salience and novelty and what they might want to know the word for, and then how is that interacting with the things that I'm manipulating. So I think there would be lots of very interesting new issues and complexities to consider.
I forgot to introduce Malte Schilling. I'm so very sorry. Just confused. So Malte joins us on this panel. He couldn't come for the whole meeting because he had other constraints, and so he was here today. And he's he's from Bielefeld, the Center for Cognitive Technology or something like that, and has a background in motor control. He worked with Holt Kruse in the past and still does so now, and he also is interested in embodied language. He did a postdoc with Srini Narayan, in fact, so he's very interestingly also bridging different fields in this array. And of course you know Tony, who was previously a chairman, who was part of our council. Sorry about forgetting that.
The difference in simplicity or complexity, of course, in the experimental setting matters for control, but I would say that in infant development, the very same configuration doesn't matter in the same sense for the baby. So what's simple or complex for a baby or for an infant, it's relative to the age of the cognitive development. It's not something objective. It's not an objective measure. So, and that's maybe one of the remarkable qualities of cognitive development, which is an active process by which the environment, the context that's relevant for the cognitive processing, for cognition in general, changes as the cognition develops. So, and I think that's, I don't know if that were the goal of the question, to try to elicit on that, but I think that's something to have into account. I don't know how this could apply to robotics or to, but it's something that's, I think, very important in human cognition. Sorry.
Okay. If a famous guy said, you have to make things simple, but not too simple. You know who it was? Okay. So, look, simplicity is like a necessary evil. If you want to model things and you want to know what's going on, well, you have to start simple. That's pretty clear. However, most of us commit this crime. We start simple, we get a solution, and then we're very silent about it. We publish it, and we forget about it. And then others go and say, okay, what did this guy say? He said this, well, I cannot do it. Well, in his effort, for example, he recognized objects. But how did he recognize objects? Using the color, because he had three objects. One was red, the other was blue, and the other one was green. So when he saw red, he knew he had this first object. When he saw blue, he knew he had this other object, and so on. So now when you try to generalize, you cannot recognize objects from their color. So this is not generalizable. So you made it simple, but you made it too simple. So you can make it simple to simplify your input, but you should not simplify your computation. You may have simple objects, but you should use very elaborate techniques in order to do the recognition. So because you are looking forward to generalizing. You don't want to do only three objects of three different colors. You want to do more. So to conclude about your comment, Gregor, is yes, we have to simplify to begin with, but we have to be very careful the way we do our simplification. I personally, I do not have a good attitude towards papers which I handle for journals or meetings or whatever, where they have simplified, but they simplify too much. Because then I know this doesn't generalize. So why are you showing me this? So you have done the initial part of the work. So you have to go deeper now. Okay? So this is my opinion. You can simplify, get your result, but don't publish it. Keep going. And then you publish the whole thing.
So thank you. I agree on that view, and I think When I saw your model, Yiannis, I thought, okay, it's not so simple, I would say. There's a lot of stuff going on. I'm sorry that I will talk a little bit about my work. I will try to cut it very brief, but so that you get an impression what I'm doing. So simple is a very crucial thing in my stuff. So I work on a minimal cognitive system. This is a robot who is able to behave in an environment, and it's biologically inspired, so it can walk around and so on. And the idea is, if we had such a grounded system, how can we make this system, which has a very limited set, and which is very simple, which has a limited set of behaviors, how can we make this into a cognitive system? And by cognitive, I mean something like planning ahead, able to plan ahead, basically. And for that, it uses something like an internal simulation loop. So on the one hand, we are quite simple because we have on this lower level only a very limited set of behaviors. Then we have these internal models who are grounded in these behaviors. And then we have something like a planning loop, which is on a higher level. And now this is a connection now to the work Srini was doing. He was talking about this middle layer, and basically what I was talking at the end about the simulation loop is basically the connection to something like a middle layer and to language. So I would say our model is very, very simple in that sense, so that it can come up with new ideas or something like this, but only for very specific behaviors. It's very narrow, but at the same time, it's like a scaffold you can use because there are behaviors on the different levels. So you have really neural networks on the motor level which control the behavior. Then you use these neural networks for motor simulation, I would say. And so the part we are working on currently and where the connection to Srini comes in is we go even up a higher level and try to build their representations too, only for the simple behaviors. So our thing is something that it cannot talk about much things. It can talk about walking, lifting your leg, pushing something with the leg or something like that. It does not know about many other things. But about these things, it knows on different levels. And I think that this is, for me, an interesting question. So where I want to approach this in a way, growing from a lower level to different levels there. And if you have something like this structure, maybe then you can grow also in different directions and say, I want to introduce new behaviors. I'm not sure, you mentioned something like that. There are basically only a very limited set of behaviors. So this could be something like a start for that there. I'm not sure if this is so easy on the lower levels, if you have only these very abstract behaviors, but I liked at least the idea behind that there, yeah.
So lower level, you mean individual limb, controlling limbs and joints, or you mean locomotion, or what is low?
Yes, so on the lowest level, we really have a controller who's controlling joints, individual joints. So this is a neural network, basically a recurrent neural network. And then there's something like, on this neuronal level, we have, of course, something like action selection and so going on. So these are clustered in smaller clusters of neural networks for the different movements which can be turned on depending on the sensory context. Yeah.
Several compressed at the same time.
At the same time, okay. I have to learn this. Maybe if the goal is minimal cognition, then the requirements are different, and we can see how far you can go with the basics. But when the goal is to be able to interact with humans, then we have a different set of constraints, because especially given that communication is the topic, given that we need to be able to communicate. And here, at least in embodiment theory, the problem was called the scaling up problem. We can solve, or we need to take into account the processes and complying with at least of the 6 marks of embodiment that Margaret Wilson distinguished and Susan reminded this morning. And this involves some sort of sensory motor processing to have that into account. But then we have to think how to go from there to a level, especially a conceptual level, so that can be the one that we can interact with. And that's, if I make like a summary comment, we'll see in these 6 talks several approaches, different approaches to try to deal with this, which can be seen somehow as complementary. At least we've got talks that try to focus on event representation, how this can provide the basics, the ground for the understanding of at least some concepts as they are labeled in a language. And there we'll see, I think, novel techniques in order to do that, or I think original. And I'm not going to maybe to criticize the Dominés as I suggested yesterday, because he's not here to defend himself. But I think that's the point. The embodiment approach helps us to understand how we can get a grasp of our world. But we don't have to forget that language as a signal, as sound, is also part of our world, something that we also have to parse, also have to detect, and that the meaning is something else. It's not just a matter of associating event with a sound, because that would be instrumental conditioning. That's what Pavlov's dog did, and that's not real meaning. For meaning, we need some understanding, some conceptual mediation. And here, I think, I don't remember exactly how it was pronounced, the second talk yesterday, Narayanan, suggested a middle level that goes beyond just sensory motor. Today, your grammar also introduces intentional terms to characterize action concepts. But the important thing to keep in mind is that our terms may be of objects or of actions. So it's not the movements that we do when we deal with objects that are the meaning of those terms. We need to go at the more abstract level. The example yesterday was close or cut or whatever. There are many movements that may be involved in cutting or in closing, so the meaning cannot be a particular movement, because then the system would need to relearn everything when the movement is different. And for this scaling up, I think this notion of schema or of image schema or maybe metaphorical grounding it's relevant.
Are there questions from the audience sort of in this direction? Oops.
Gregor, I think we have the classical problem that 2 people running the show isn't really a very good system. So what I would suggest is that since you're already running the show, you try to do both of these things, right? So you try to control the people who are sitting and everybody else. So if somebody wants to ask a question, which we should try to get everybody involved now, then,
Happy to do that, sorry.
Speak to Gregor and yeah? Okay.
I would like to come back to probably provocative advice of Yiannis to not publish simple models, like apart from its implications for a young career. If you look at Larissa's model, it was a very simple model. It was really only color and label and space. But there was some conceptual insight there, that space is important for binding feature and label. And she publishes this model, and then someone can look at it and then say, okay, let's think how you could add more features and not only have color, but have more complex object representation. Then someone else can come and have, very complex object representation. But this would not happen if the first simple model of Larissa would be published, right?
I would say that this is field dependent. So when I was talking about the simple models, I was referring to work in engineering and computer science and robotics. I was not referring to psychology work, because it may appear simple, but it is actually very involved for the state of the art in psychology. Yeah. So simplicity is a relative term.
Hi, I have maybe an ugly question. When talking about the idea of simplicity, what do you think the role of productization and standardization in research with a view towards, for example, complex solutions that work for like localization, for maybe object recognition, etc., when they get to a certain maturity, that they can then be effectively either standardized or productized so that others can use these as building blocks and then go from there. So there's a little bit this kind of a move from an idea being in an academic world to being more in a product, and then to be the basis for other academics and the role that that can play.
You are talking about the availability of modules of software, for example, that people can use.
For example, or even in a simpler context, in order to be able to do vision, someone had to build a camera. So someone had to solve the problem of building a camera with sufficient resolution. So then it becomes something you can buy off the shelf. So then if you have this maybe with the motors as well, the evolution of motor design, and in order to arrive that you can actually pick it off a shelf. So if you have this as well I guess the obvious example is in software for...
Yeah, I think this is the miracle of computer science, today. And you can already see it, people talk about, they say, oh, you have a paper. Oh, okay, so do you have code? And, then you have some people saying, well, yeah, we have some code, but, we cannot really make it public. And you have some others that say, yes, the code is in that address, and you can download it. And you have others who say, yeah, I would like to make it public, but maybe I think too highly of my stuff, so maybe I can get rich out of that code. Some people, people I meet, some people think they can get rich from software, which is not the case anymore. Okay? Nobody can get rich from software anymore because the Chinese are breaking every software in a few days. If you put out software, then in 5 days you will find your code somewhere sitting in the internet. So it makes more sense, I advise young people, to make your stuff public and open for everyone. And the more people use it, the more power to you. The more people use it, the more power to you. That's how it works. Then if many people use it, then you will be able to find a way to make money, if that's your interest, in some other way. But not with that. So, in my opinion, and I have suggested this very often in editorial boards for some of the journals, if you don't give the code, you cannot publish the paper. It's still too early. Maybe it will happen in 10 years or 20 years. Like biology is more advanced. When you publish a paper in biology, you have to give everything, your samples, the whole thing. They have a way of doing it, people who work on genes or people who work on proteins or stuff, they have to give it. We don't have to. Often I see a paper published and I see the results, and then I contact the author and I say, can we use your code to make a comparison? Then there are a few kinds of people. One class of people never answers. I don't like those people. They never answer their email. There's another group of people saying, well, we are not ready to give the code out. There's a problem there. Okay? So your point is very well taken. And young people should, with their publications, they should put code out so that others can use it. And the more people use your code, the better off you are. At least you are guaranteed tenure in an academic institution.
That's good. I wanted to react in a different way, and more abstractly. So on the one hand, these things are all real and a constant struggle. On the other hand, I think that there's also a specific problem with this embodiment approach that we're examining, preaching here. And today here, this meeting was about embodied communication. We've seen other aspects of that. And one of the themes is that it all depends. It's all quite specific. For instance, the perception problems that show up here are essentially general computer vision perception problems, but I think the insight has arisen that there is no universal solution. You don't have just perception per se. You have perception for something. For instance, perception for language, and your approach is actually very clear about that, goes for cues and elements and important concepts that are good for that function, and perception for navigation or for steering or for for grasping and so on, is different. And that is part of what we know in the nervous system, that there are these special channels, that there are different modules, that there's perception for something, therefore, the whole scientific building is about that. And that means that it is much harder to define norms, interfaces, modules that are reusable. So if you compare that to classical AI, let's say, there's much less of a consensus, at least, and perhaps scientifically it's not even possible to divide the system up into these chunks that we can reuse in every different context. And I think it's a practical challenge, but it's also a scientific challenge. And in that sense, I think it's perhaps deep and something that we should think about deeply. And going too early toward introducing convention means sort of bringing in theory through the back door that we haven't really examined enough. Well, it's more conservative.
You take a more conservative approach. My friend Gregor takes a more conservative approach. However, you can imagine the pandemonium theory. That what he says is true. Some people will produce code that will not be that useful, because that's what it would mean. However, imagine that you have the situation and you have 100 pieces of code, and you try this, you try that, you throw that, you take this, you try that, you combine this with that. That's not bad. It's sort of a new space to work on, where you have, plug and play, as they say. Because many people are interested in some question, but they are not interested in all these other things that come together with that question. So it would be nice to have a black box to take care of that while they concentrate on this other question. Okay? I don't think there's a panacea for this. But the more working code that is available, I think the better off we are as a community.
I can also make a more conservative statement about that, but in fact that might lead off to the next topic that I was at least aiming for, but maybe yours is still a little bit connected to this? Yeah, you wanted to comment? We have a microphone for you.
Well, actually, the question was very different from what was discussed. I mean, the title is what may we learn from human embodied cognition to implement artificial cognitive systems. The other way around, I mean, the two psychologists here, did you learn something from the engineering projects, and will it be useful at all? And if it is useful, maybe it's really when the connection is made.
I mean, I find a real implementation that is somewhat simplified really helpful, right? Because the human is not simple, and you can't take it apart. You can't look under the hood in any very informative way. You can get some areas of the brain and try to make inferences at that level, but seeing structures that we know how they function allows you to do really different things, I think, and kind of those two ends working together seem like the right solution to the problem, right? You have to simplify, but we know the simplification is a simplification, and you have to understand the complex system, try and drive that as you're trying to build up the simple system, and eventually maybe you'll meet in the middle or keep trying, right? So, I don't know. The robots were really fun, and they'll inform my thinking for sure.
Yeah, so I would also agree that I mean, just as I find modeling work critical to trying to understand the assumptions that are being made, that I might not have realized otherwise in the problem that I'm asking the child, or in the question the field's asking. The robotics work does a similar thing in terms of what are the constraints and what are the things that you need to have to even before you get to that question, maybe, right? I've also found it very interesting in terms of the types of questions I get asked about my work. So I was actually just jotting a note because I've had several people ask about the temporal aspects of the MODI task, right? And a couple questions about, well, isn't it just the last object they saw before you did the naming event, and could it be binding based on that kind of congruence? Or, you know, what are the delay properties? And as children get older and they can remember things for longer periods of time, you know, how might that play in, right? And that's a whole nother level. Those aren't necessarily the same questions I get when I present those studies in different audiences, right? And I don't know, you know, what the motivation is that makes it completely different, but it does make me think about different sets of questions. And then the question about, and I don't know where she is right, the question about whether the binding between the word and the label is really in terms of motor coordinates, or is it in terms of, or a motor plan, or is it really in terms of an abstract word representation? And, or how would you move if it is in one to the other, right? So those kind of questions in terms of thinking about what next steps and how you might now need to elaborate that simple model to kind of move in doing other kinds of things. Yeah, definitely. And then listening to everybody else's work and thinking, too, about, so in some of the talks yesterday, from my developmental perspective, thinking about how some of the systems that are being talked about in terms of robotic contexts, there is a lot within the developmental literature in terms of informing how those come to be, right? And it feels sometimes, as I listen, that there's a lot of writing a very complex model to do lots of big things, whereas in development sometimes we see that there are smaller chunks that are getting kind of built upon, almost more like the framework you're talking about, where you might have a deep understanding of a few number of things, but you can generalize it to do different things and maybe build off of it. Likewise, in development, we don't see that children do everything at once, right? And even some of the things we think they do very well at once, they're actually only doing very well in some particular circumstances with particular kinds of support, right? And understanding how those things may then be kind of built over time in the system to make something much more complex, I think, is interesting. And I like hearing about how you take the components in a robot and do some of that, and what we know from other kinds of studies and how they might go together to inform that future process, I guess.
May I add, you implicitly said that, but just for this audience, I thought useful to make it explicit that often theoretical modeling, mathematical or simulation modeling, can play an important role in making that link. That is, if you have a theoretical model, it could be sort of an interface between the experience that you gain from having to specify all the technical details when you build a system, and versus making a somewhat more local analysis when you can measure one aspect, but you don't measure everything from the retina to the movement in experiment. And in the model, you can control these interfaces, and as you try to, in the model, usually you have to model the paradigm. You have to say what inputs there are, and so on. And that is actually often the point where you learn from the attempt to also act out that model. You see that, well, there are huge gaps, or you see, as in our field has happened, that in that innocent interface, you hide the whole problem. For instance, there are people who use neural network models where one neuron stands for one object and the other neuron for another object. Well, if you act that out on a robot, then you recognize that the whole difficult object recognition problem was hidden in that interface, and that model says nothing about the object concept, really. And sometimes these models have been used to talk about object concept, right? That would be an example. I'd say I'm not disinterested because that's part of my job, so I'm making a pitch for that.
And I'll add, psychologists, of course, we're trying hard to work against our intuitions, but everyone out there is a folk psychologist, and everyone out there has their own theories of how kids develop and what the key ingredients are. And we often think we know what the implications of those assumptions are, and that, of course, you can learn this through this process without ever actually having tried to implement it, right? And it's only when you go in and try to implement that some of the big flaws in those assumptions become clear, because we're studying a level which is the level at which we understand the world, and so that can introduce big problems in our thinking that are really hard to recognize. And so I hope that implementations, and I've seen evidence where implementations really help us identify those areas of study that have been completely overlooked.
And I think going a little farther in terms of the developmental work, we do that too. Everybody's a folk psychologist about what babies can do and how they're doing it in lots of ways. Because we all have, most of us have experience with those kind of contexts and how we interacted with them. And a lot of times trying to implement makes, again, clear what assumptions you have about what babies can do and where the information is coming from in ways. So I sometimes watch roboticists as they're trying to implement something, the level of question and detail and how hard they are on themselves about how to make this right and what not to assume and how to make it the right level of simple. But then you switch and you look at early human behavior and you just say, oh, the baby did that. That means they have all of this. When in fact, all we know is they have what they did at that point in terms of that behavior given what you gave them to perform it, right? So we don't always ask the same questions about when a child does something that looks really, really smart. Is it really, really smart because we know what the answer was? Or is it really, really smart because that baby knows all that, right? They may know that word, but they don't know that word like you know that word, right? Bear is not the same thing for a very young child as it is for you, right? And we forget that sometimes until we have to implement it. And I think that's another way that the robotics and modeling can be very useful.
Let me give you a very quick personal story of my interaction with the developmental psychologists. I have been interacting with them for quite some time, and I wanted to find the answer to one question. What's that question? The question is, are there objects / concepts that children learn before others, before other concepts? Can you tell me 1, table, 2, chair, 3, knife, 4? Can you give me some order of objects that the children learn? Because obviously the first concept that the child will learn is not serendipity or audacity. It's something concrete, something down-to-earth thing, right? So in this meeting, I'm very happy because Larissa has given me a resource, some database, which is not exactly what I was asking, but it comes close to it in the sense that it has information about words that children learn in which month and what percentage of them. Like 25% of children know the word blah, blah, blah by month 5 or 15 or whatever, something like that. So I hope to mine that resource and make my own list, because when you do robotics, imagine you have a robot, and the robot has to learn objects. What's the first thing the robot has to learn? Well, in my opinion, it has to learn the ground. If you don't know where the ground is, you're in big trouble. Okay, after that, what? So I was very happily surprised to learn that children learn very early to distinguish between solids and liquids. This is unknown in computer vision because we can't deal with liquids. So the children learn very early on about this. This is a hidden category. And that is my nightmare. What if the problem of object recognition is dependent on a number of hidden categories? Things that we are not, conscious about. You know, let me give you, I'll stop with this experiment from, I'll tell you an experiment from von Helmholtz, a German guy, 100 years ago experiment. What he did is he took a bottle from glass. No letters, nothing here, pure glass. And half of it full of water. So, you know, if you have a bottle like that and you look at it in a mirror that is curved, then you see it upside down. It reverses, depending on the distance from the focal points and so on. Okay, so what he did then is you turn it like that, water till middle, and you look inside the mirror. When you look inside the mirror, you will see it right side up. And where will the water be? The water is supposed to be at the top. But you don't see the water at the top. You see the water at the bottom. Why? What does it mean to see the water? The only thing you see is a line, because it's water. You have a completely transparent thing. You see this line. So you look at this, and you move it a little bit so that this line will move, and then you see the water is at the bottom. You can do this experiment in your room tonight. Really. It's amazing. Which means what? Which means that it's possible, because what's happening here, gravity is playing a trick. I mean, you are not comfortable with it in the water up there, because how is it staying there? This is against what you know. So it has to be at the bottom. So it's possible that there exists a set of hidden categories. And one of them is gravity, the other one could be containment, because most objects are containers. This is a container, this is a container, this is a container. Almost everything is a container. Your pockets are containers, your mouth is a container. Containers are there. The room is a container. A house is a container. So, to finalize my nightmare about vision, it's possible that there exists a set of hidden categories like that. Solid, liquid, container, gravity, causation, things like that. And they work synergistically together to tell you what the object is. Well, I hope it's not like that. And if there are such hidden categories, they are somewhere enabling some processes. But I hope it's just not the whole thing. Because what are we going to do? So anyway, my final sentence, developmental psychology can work miracles for us if they can give us very precise results about what children do, which from what I have seen, they are not doing that yet because it's not clear. Some children first learn this, some other children first learn that, depending on how you expose them and all that. But it would be nice if we can get some principles out of the developmental psychologists that say, for example, you cannot learn these words before you learn those verbs, for example. I don't know if that is even true, or vice versa. Okay.
Yeah, I just want to add on, because I think I got the same points from the talks this morning there. That it's, for me, the good thing was there basically, so you were talking about that space is special, and this is something which we see there in children. And if we're looking in the robotic literature or in the modeling literature as such, there's lots of talk of image schemas and so on. It's going on spatial things like containment and so on, or relations there. And the other candidates you named there, basically, there's one difference, I think, to the spatial stuff, which is all of those were dynamic. When you said something like gravity or something like this, we're always thinking, or I would think about gravity in the form of a dynamic things there. I think this is an important thing, that we have probably the spatial schemas, and then we need at some point something like dynamic schemas. So you named them grammar there. I would come from the action side and would not use the linguistic terms or temporal structure in some way. This was my question to Larissa. So what would change with children if they get older? would these temporal relations have an effect there? And would after a time, for children, temporal structure become also special in some way? And I would suggest so, yeah.
May I follow up on this and connected to your question? One of the concepts that appear later are these relational concepts. To go back to yesterday's talk, it was funny that the example was left and right, which is one of the special relations that take longer to children to learn, 7 years. Or inside, above, below, special relationship, temporal relationship also. Especially the temporal concepts that do not involve the present right now take to understand a week or a month or a year, that's difficult. And we have social relations as well. And the interesting thing that relates to the main topic is that many of these concepts, or not to say all of them, we learn through language. We don't have an independent grasp of the concept before or outside of the language. We first hear the label, and then we have to figure out what's the relation that's involved here. And that, I think, gives language some sort of restructuring effect on human cognition, which requires going beyond a simplistic view of language learning, just tagging or labeling something that's already there. Because part of our conceptual repertoire is created through or is motivated through the label that requires us to think of, to try to find out what's the referent for that. And the referent, not in a particular element, even if it's connected to the context by one, but we generalize or we abstract away to things of that kind. And when it's relations, there are so many of them that to find out which one is relevant in that context, even that there are so many possibly relevant ones, is not trivial. I don't know if there is any idea how to go in this direction.
So it definitely isn't trivial, right? And it is something learned much later. But a fun kind of complexity to this issue is that one of our colleagues at Iowa, Ed Wasserman, does studies with pigeons, and pigeons can do relational mapping, right? So they can do these mappings between, and he does very elegant studies to kind of pull apart the nature of what kinds of cues they could be using to do this. But so they can do these mappings between bigger and smaller, and he's got a nice series of studies looking at some of the classic generalizations of learning theory based on Spence and Hull, where you learn actually relations between two circles in a series at one end, right, smaller and larger, and then you have to generalize that all the way across the spectrum without getting kind of, and how well you can do that depends on the specific stimuli to get you to see along the way, right? So there's something that is low-level available so that these animals who don't have language can also kind of do this. Doesn't mean it's the same way that the human babies, right, do it. But it's interesting to kind of think about, and another way to kind of approach this question of what might be necessary, right? So if you have a model that can do what the pigeons can do, what's kind of in there, and how is it moving forward?
So is your question to this sort of topic? Yeah?
Yeah, so I just wanted to jump in with a question to what Yiannis said. So of course we can get a lot of insights from, in building our systems, can gain a lot of insights from developmental psychology and from how children conceptualize things and how they learn. But would the order of acquisition of different concepts in children be of primary importance for us? Because there are at least a couple factors that influence the acquisition order. One is the experience space of the child. One is the conceptual limitations of the child. For instance, the ability to process concrete versus abstract concepts, or to process to generalize, to process irregularity, and so on. Whereas for machines or artificial cognitive agents, I think it may be more important for them to be able to compatibly operate in the same experience space as we do. And also, many of the systems will operate in relatively restricted environments. For instance, vision recognition could find solutions in learning or traffic management and or security. And then, of course, the concepts that they would need would be entirely different. So you wouldn't have the constraints that children have in their earlier development, and you would have a different set of concepts that your systems would have to process, right? So, of course, we can get insights, but is it really that critical?
Well, you put your finger on a very important topic, okay? So basically what your colleague is saying is that a system, what is a system, an agent? It's a system that is performing actions. And for those kinds of actions that it is performing, it will have to recognize objects that go with those actions. And it has a particular morphology. It may have legs, it may not. It has a particular computational capacity. It may only have one laptop, or it may have a whole, the whole cloud. It may have 20,000 computers. So basically, there exists a lot of variability in the computational capacity, in the mobility characteristics and the morphology of the system, the memory of the system, and so on and so forth. And now you say, okay, I have this system, and I want the system to perform these general behaviors in these spaces. And now you want to press a button, and you have some kind of a compiler that is going to tell you, this system has to have this component, and that component, and that component, and it has to recognize those kinds of objects, and it has to blah, blah, and you're done, right? It would be nice, but it's very hard. It's almost impossible. And these kinds of questions have given me the feeling that a general theory of robotics may be impossible. Or where by general theory we mean, you have a lot of freedom on the manipulator. What is it that you manipulate? You have a nose, a tongue, hands, knives, whatever. You have a size, capacities, and you live in a particular world. And, So to have a general theory, it would allow you to do the thing that I imagined before, that given all these constraints, you press this button and that compiler is telling you how the system should be, right? That's what would be sort of ideal. And I do not know if this is possible, to be honest with you. It may. Maybe we are lacking some concept. But most probably it's not. It is as hard as evolution. And, the same way that evolution had to work for a very long time to find solutions in particular situations and so on and so forth, the same way we need to invest time and effort in order to develop solutions of various kinds. On the other hand, it would be really very beautiful if a general theory of robotics / intelligence was possible.
I would argue if we want to think about, the human as some sort of general problem solver, we don't just get one of those either, right? We start off very, very small and not really able to do much of anything besides, suck, cry, and sleep. And it takes a long time to get to where we get to, and there's a lot that happens along the way. Karen Adolph just published this beautiful paper. I forget how many falls. Do you remember? In learning to walk, children fall something like 12,000 times.
And they walk the equivalent of 3 football fields like a week or something like that. In terms of, again, this development that we see that appears to be so fast, but we don't always realize the sheer amount of practice
every day
and experience that's going into that's used to create it, right? And if you think about your robots learning to walk, the amount of practice that it gets.
You might not want to have your robot you might not think you're on the right path if you've just fallen for the 12,000th time, right? But
that may be exactly where
that's how the human did it.
want to maybe shift a little bit to topic? Are you on the same topic? You want?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I think what you just
After
said
that,
is really interesting, because perhaps we need to rethink some of the historic stuff that we've learned about developmental psychology, because here we're talking about embodied cognition, but frankly the historic literature has not really looked at embodied cognition. So do we even have the building blocks for the theoretical frameworks to inform our experimental paradigms, let alone model it? I mean, I'm pretty convinced fairly recently that there's some real value in dynamic neural field theory and connectionism to some degree. So I think the mathematical modeling is there to help us, but what are we applying it to? That's my dilemma, because at the moment, perhaps we're applying it not to the wrong conceptual frameworks, but even maybe not to the right questions, which I think was alluded to earlier.
Yeah, and I certainly wouldn't want to go and badmouth my own field, but I would certainly, I get very concerned that there is, and I see this when I go to other kinds of meetings too, a view of all the things that babies can do because we haven't really asked the questions about how that comes to be, right? So the history of the field kind of is from going from, this is very, very rough, of course, but Piaget kind of saying there are all these things that they can't do until they hit these certain stages in a very logical order, to then a series of studies that were the amazing baby kind of phenomena, and here's all the things they can do, and let's see exactly how early we can see some of these things be shown, right? To less understanding the nature of the processes that make those things realized in time. And I think we're moving that way. And part of it is that it's really, really hard, right? I showed you 2 quick video clips of these studies with babies with the head-mounted cameras, right? And some of you may also know Deb Roy's work at MIT, right, with this speech gnome project and the very, very rich data sets, and not even having these ways of kind of analyzing them or coding them, right? So there's a lot of work to be done to move into this. Or Karen Adolph's work, as Susan mentioned, hours and hours and hours and miles of these graphs of babies' footfalls and looking how close the footfalls are and how regular they are and how long are the strides and things like this, to really understand the minute little changes that are happening over time and the sheer amount of experience they actually have in creating those things, right? And I don't think we've fully appreciated it, so it's not necessarily clear that we know exactly what we're needing to capture in some of these cases.
Yeah. Where do we go from here, then? What's the top 10 list of what we need to have to be able to move forward?
Oh, wow. Lots of money, so I can get, I mean, I really, for language and things like this, I really like these studies with these very rich data sets. I mean, I was contemplating, now we have all these really cool technologies, these life diary things where you can wear a little camera on your lapel, right, and it'll take a picture every 30 seconds. Man, if I had that, I could tell you which object one particular baby is going to learn at a particular time because I'm going to see, right? So those kind of things, I think, the tools that are developed actually in these kind of contexts as well for helping to analyze complex time series data, code it. I mean, some of the things I saw in yours, I'm like, I want that to code the things I'm seeing babies do in my lab, right? That would help so much from the hand kind of coding, right? These visual recognitions, I am doing it on a simple table. It would work. It would help, right? Being able to put that then into a database where then I could go through and pull out all those time things and then put it in a model so I could see what the constants are. I mean, there's a lot, and I don't know that I've even fully, of course. And then these kind of questions that come up from other perspectives that kind of help change the way you look at it and think about new ways. What are we missing, right? If I had to build it, where would I start? Oh, no, I don't actually know that, and so I need to go and look, right, which are the interesting questions that have been brought up. So,
yeah. Maybe I wanted to connect back to something we started discussing earlier. So another thing that I noticed is a difference between, say, the people working with humans and those working with technical systems is, in a sense, I felt that psychologists are more radical about, I would say, looking at language afresh from this embodiment perspective. Maybe it's easier because you just have to say it, and you have effects to prove it. And the particular, exactly. But let's just make that point for, as a contrast. And I feel that for us, when we're trying to build these technical systems, there's a terrible pull toward, in a sense, the old view, because we're using techniques from the old view. You use, for instance, the tree structures. And if Peter had been here, I would have been bashing him a little bit on that, because he was very much buying into the conceptual framework. I would say that was classical, and that would be an approach where you say, well, there's language, and now I'm just going to put the perception thing in front, and I'm going to organize that a little bit. I mean, I understand that there is the need, because you have to have something, and you can't invent everything at the same time. But I do sense that there are things in the data that suggest, again, problems that we might be sweeping under the rug. For instance, Susan pointed out about the importance of synchronicity, or synchrony is the right term, right? And a lot of what we do is atemporal. I mean, it's just sequences, and the events arise in a way that is unrelated to the actual perceptual processing. And I think that's an important problem. That's something I would have asked Peter, how he does that. And Srini was also using pretty much an atemporal approach. I mean, the whole processing framework is decoupled from the sensory motor kind of time. So I just want to throw that out. I'm already providing an apology in a little bit for the technical guys, but I would say, well, maybe we should be a bit more radical and open our systems to lower level things, to lower level sensory motor things.
So, sorry, I haven't heard Srini's talk really, because I just arrived later on. So I like one of Yiannis' comments at the end. So basically when you talked about the grammar and somebody asked, so your answer was something like, I'm coming from the language side, so this is why I take this structure and I find it useful in action. And this is what I found pretty cool there, because there's temporal structure in action, and I have something and I use it. So my understanding of Srini's work and how I approach this in a bottom-up way is basically the other way around. So we're coming from the action side in some way, or I'm coming more from the action side and Srini there probably. And we're just trying to use the structure then for language also. So we would say, okay, we don't use grammar to model action sequences in some way, but we have action structure, temporal structures, and these are probably something very important there. And this is something which we can see in language. So language is something like a window into these underlying temporal structures. And from my perspective, so I wasn't too much interested in language in the beginning, but then the questions which pop up there in language really is something which are useful if you're just going for systems to try to plan or something like this. Because the questions Srini addressed with the simulation semantics, and I would say they're really asynchronous also. They're continuous flows and so on, and it can be branching and so on. These things they do, they're really quite massive, and I would say this is something you can't probably model in grammar in this way, or you need a specific additional mechanism there. So what impressed me in the first meetings, there was something like they can cope, or they have to cope with real hard problems like this flexibility of language. You address this on different levels, things. You don't, if they talk about the simulation semantics, they don't have to do this always on the motor level. I would follow you completely there that this should go deeper, and this is what we try to do basically, because the simulation idea, or this idea of embodied simulation, mental simulation going on, is something which works on different levels. So I think the most research is done on motor simulation. People will think of mental rotations and so on, and then you find the same timing for these mental rotations like the real rotations. But we as humans can do this in a completely different way. If we talk about something, we not completely have to simulate all that is mentioned in a sentence. If I'm talking, okay, now I will go to San Francisco or something, or Berkeley, which is a nice place, then it's not that everybody's like, okay, for the next 12 hours I can't process anything else because my simulation, I have to sit in the airplane for that long. But we just have we have a general feeling of what are the, then it's coming these higher levels, what is a post condition basically in some way. maybe post-condition doesn't sound radical anymore because it's so connected to artificial intelligence and so on. But I think the important step is then that this middle layer, or however you call it, it's not just an interface, or how do we plug these two levels together but it should be really flexible in the way that we always can unfold this. Because when I say I go to San Francisco, and then you say, oh yeah, but the Düsseldorf airport is currently under construction or something like this. This is something where I immediately could jump in and understand what you mean and unfold this plan, and could go even deeper as far as I would go. And so I think this is very, very important what we can learn there.
No, your claim for low-level processes remind me, as she also mentioned, Piaget. Piaget distinguished between microgenetic processes from ontogenetic processes. So he was interested in seeing how these adaptive processes may change in a small time scale from changes that take longer. And I don't know if anybody working at these two levels, because the pressure of the scientific career make it difficult, for instance, to set longitudinal studies that take a couple of years to realize that's make it more difficult. But if for language we have this database that's called the childless. I don't know if it's known in this, most people in this audience may not know, which is a collection of studies, longitudinal studies of individual children while they're learning the language in the second or the third year of life, 4, depends. And then we might have real data that can be used for simulation, for models. But not at this microgenetic level, but this is at this longitudinal time scale. It will be interesting.
Well, I would actually suggest you could do it based on childless, maybe at this level in the context of language, maybe not in others. But so in some of our work looking at the fast mapping problem or the reference selection problem, seeing how in this task where it's a mutual exclusivity task, so you give children 2 objects they know and then an unfamiliar one, in the time scale of picking out that object, they do one thing. But as they start to add things into their lexicon, the way that process unfolds over a longer time scale really starts to change. And you see it also playing out then if you do a kind of looking-based reaction time task to move your eye to the object. You've got 2 things you know, and now all you have to do is fixate on the one that is the one you know. The speed of reaction time from 18 to 20 to 24 months changes with what you know, how many words you have in that lexicon, even if those are not the words you're being probed on at that moment, right? And so you can start to kind of look at how moment-by-moment learning of individual words starts to build up in this network and change the way longer-term processes happens and how you end up doing something in the moment as well. Because it changes your novelty bias, it changes your speed of processing, it changes lots of different things.
I think so. We probably slowly draw to a close. I throw out one more thing that's just maybe good to close. I've been asked, in fact, I have been asked by a journalist who accompanies us here, what is this stuff good for? And that's often, of course, a very natural question, public money involved, and we all are exposed to that all the time. Of course, we are in an age where the German concept of Bildung is no longer really an accepted value necessarily. That is, we always think there has to be economic value, social value, and some people think military value to the sort of things we do. Now, that's a general question, but I wonder if we're not also touching a little bit sort of the third major philosophical revolution, the change from the Copernican to the Copernican system, where suddenly we were no longer at the center of the universe, and the Darwinian revolution, where we were no longer necessarily at the center of life. And something like that is brewing for a while, where we then retreated to the most intelligent cognitive machine, the only true cognitive machine. And language was, of course, the decisive difference. We already have these chess computers. It's kind of annoying, and you wonder if you should keep playing chess. And then we have Google and can search in a way, of course, that nobody can do. In fact, some of us give up ordering their files on the computer because you can search more effectively rather than order things, something that we used to think, that would be the white-collar worker was the one who ordered files. And so now that's no longer really so relevant. And here, I think, in this field, we're finding out that it's so particular that, that our communication is based around some core actions, perhaps some core percepts, quite specifically tuned to the fact that we have these arms. They're short when we was young. So we a lot of special purpose things that we can understand embedded in evolution. And so we could wonder, maybe we're not that special. We can be surpassed in forms of intelligence that we can mathematically define, that AI was always aiming at easily, and we're just these peculiar little cognition machines whose cognition is really specifically built to communicate with others primarily, so social, right, and to maybe hunt a few rabbits, do very quick action perception, maybe to cut a few things, but maybe not to study the universe or to find the most penetrating statistics. So it really would sort of change our position. Or I guess one could glorify that. I wonder if anyone who wants to say something at that level. Or from the audience. Or will that be our closing remarks? Maybe. Yeah.
So basically, you are suggesting that the human could just be at some level, and that there are higher levels of intelligence that are becoming within our reach, the cognitive systems. That's what you are saying.
Yeah, perhaps, yeah.
So this is a new era. A new era is dawning. Gregor is pointing to it, and I think he's right. He's very right. And, it's smelling in the air in some way, because, there's all this diversity, people are getting together, mixing up cultures, this, that, and somehow the technological advances that are happening are suggesting that something like that is in the horizon. And in my opinion, that is coming together with something else. And what is that something else? Those robots, they will replace labor. No one will have to work anymore. No one will have any work anymore. Exactly. So people will do what pleases them. Like you write poems, you take a walk, you are a mentor for a kid in your neighborhood. And the capitalists, because the capitalists will profit big time when they replace people in their factories with robots. The capitalists will have to give us checks. Every month we'll get a check. There will be nothing for us to do. Nothing. A small group of us will be working on those robots, and the rest of us will be enjoying life. In my opinion, the current unemployment levels in the world are going to be the smallest. From now on, it's going to be going up. unemployment will probably reach 50, 60, 70%. But there will not be a global revolution. Will not start killing each other. You already see Putin is getting Crimea. There's not even one nose bleeding. We have become more sophisticated. So there will not be a revolution because the capitalists will take care that there will not be a revolution. So in my opinion, labor will be replaced. And then it will be a matter of resources. If energy is cheap, then we'll be in perfect condition. If energy is very expensive, then we may end up in totalitarian regimes. But with Putin producing all this gas and the Americans doing all this fracking, seems to me energy is going to very cheap levels. So I'm very optimistic for the future.
So that was sort of the non-philosophical version.
Wait, I can go even I'll go even more non-philosophical and all the way to pop culture. So did anybody see the movie Her? You right? Yeah. I mean, I won't, if everybody hasn't seen it, I won't give it away. But when you see this is a movie about embodiment, right? The embodiment of the neural system is what I would say, that there are constraints in our neural system in terms of our processing, and that means that we think in certain ways and in certain time courses that this system that was freed from those constraints didn't have to deal with, and it goes in the direction that Gregor's talking about, and that's what I'll say. So very interesting movie on that front.
I think this is a good place to stop our panel. I would like to thank the panelists for taking the time and the energy. Especially like to thank Malte for actually coming, especially for the panel. And I would like to thank the audience for participating. You actually steered us pretty much through this panel discussion. I'm not going to give a very long closing statement, but I want to mention the crew who ran here this meeting. And it was outstanding. I actually was abroad most of the time and had to do other things, so they actually did everything. Some of them are here. Claudius Strup and Jean-Stefan Jockheit might be here. Are you here? Yes. So they organized a lot of the crew and set everything in place. We had Sebastian, Jonas, Mattis, Oliver, and whom did I miss? Someone else at the technical... Stefan, I mentioned Stefan, yes. I did run here all these technical things. We had in the background our secretaries who didn't actually show up at all, but corresponded with some of you. Catherine Schmidt, in particular, did a lot of the... here's Claudius and Jean-Stefan. We just clapped. And so our secretaries did a lot of the background work, and we will have a little party here in Bochum to celebrate their contributions. And we actually, all the students in the lab ran the front desk. You might have met Kai, Claudia, Guido, I think, and people taking care of the wardrobe and so on. It's a really amazing collective effect and all pretty much organized by the team itself. Really appreciate the effort. Okay. So with that, I would hand over to Vincent, who's the coordinator of the project, who will announce something about the next project.
Okay. If I may, as a philosopher, say we shouldn't be so philosophical about, optimistic about the prospects of superintelligence, I think. There is, from one Greek to another, there's more to moussaka than cutting an aubergine. On the other hand, I recently conducted a survey amongst experts on when they think superintelligence is due. And the median estimate is 2040. However, the standard deviation between the estimates is gigantic. So we'll see. If it's 2040, then maybe we have a chance to be around. Anyway, thanks to everybody for contributing in your various ways to the success of this meeting. I traditionally announce towards the end of our members' meeting what the next members' meeting will be like. So the next meeting will be in Genoa, in Italy, 17th and 18th of October. We are planning to talk there on the perspectives of cognitive systems, that is the science, the engineering, and the use of cognitive systems. So we think it's fitting that we talk about an outlook at that point, because that will be the last meeting in the EUCogIII network as we know it, that is funded by the European Commission. And one thing that we will have to think about before that and on that meeting is what we're going to do next. So if there is going to be some kind of EUCogIII network after this, and in what format, and so on, which is one of the reasons why we asked you about that in the questionnaire, which hopefully you all filled in, and if you haven't, then please do. So where's the network going and where is cognitive systems going are these two major things that we're going to discuss there. The other thing I usually do is to recommend that you register for that meeting, but I don't do that now because 194 of you have already done that, to my surprise. So we just closed the registration in a haste, and we will see what we can do in terms of both budget and space, whether we can accommodate more people in that meeting, and I'll keep you posted on how that will go. Okay, good. Thank you. Have a good trip home.